Hi, my name is Abe, and my pronouns are they, them. Bonjour, je m'appelle Abe, et je suis non-binaire. Hola, me llamo Abe, y uso el lenguaje inclusivo. But I didn't always know these things about myself. So hopefully you're here today because you want to learn a little bit more about this topic. I'm here today because language has always been a very strong part of my life, as has gender. And I found that they've interacted in ways that have been really fascinating and compelling, especially as I've grown older, as social media has become a more prevalent part of my life. I'm particularly fascinated about the ways that language can form the world around us. It can help shape it, it can define it, in some cases restrict it, and in other cases expand it. And I think that that kind of concept is really interesting when you come to talking about how we understand ourselves. So I want to start by telling you a story, and we're going to go right up and personal with a baby picture of me. So I was born in Oxford, England, thus the uniform that you see here. I spent most of my life in Paris, and I grew up completely bilingual. This kind of duality in my life of existing in two spaces was something that I really cherished. It's something really powerful in terms of growing up bilingual and having that privilege and that opportunity. It was also something that I, at times, struggled with. There was a sense of duality there that it meant I never really knew how to answer certain questions. I mean, raise your hand if you've struggled to answer the question, where are you from? Especially at this conference, right? I think it's something we're all familiar with. So I never really had a singular answer to that question. Other questions are things like, what is your nationality? Or there's one question that was weirdly popular, which is, what language do you dream in? Which is a funny first question to ask people, but one that I would get a lot, and I would kind of struggle with identifying one answer, one non-complicated answer to give that. I eventually settled on something that had elements both of French and English, but also was kind of beyond those binary terms, and I still use that term today. I say that I'm European. So clearly you see that there's a theme here of me finding other terms where I get to weasel out of having to pick one or the other. And I'm sharing that with you because I had a very similar process when I started thinking about my gender and my sense of self. Growing up with Romance languages meant that that sense of gender was a very strong part of language. It's always very binary in its understanding of self, but also of tables and chairs and beards. Everything's gendered one way or another. And when I started realizing my non-binary identity, I realized that I didn't actually have language. I didn't have words that I could use to talk about this, to conceptualize it, to think about it within myself. And it was particularly hard in French, which is actually my preferred language to speak. I reached the point where I would say the line that I feel like I don't exist in French anymore, which is a really difficult thing to experience as someone who was brought up bilingual, native in both cultures. So one of the points to kind of bring it back to language, and I see Alex Rawlings is sat right there. I'm going to quote one of your blog posts. Yes, you. In one of your blog posts, Alex talks about this concept of native privilege, where we don't really resonate with the question, or sometimes you say the phrase, I wish you could meet me in my language. I wish you could get to know me in my language. And that expresses this sense of when my knowledge of language is limited, my capacity for talking about myself, for explaining myself, is curbed somewhat. And it means that language defines how much I can be myself or how much I can express myself around you. That's very much how I felt around gender. It felt like I didn't have the language to talk to you about myself or to talk to myself about myself. So I set out to try and find words and language that I could use to talk about gender. And that's the journey that we're going to be taking today together. The quick catch-up in terms of why I'm here today is that after living in Paris, I moved back to England. I did an undergraduate degree and a master's degree in gender at the LSE. I now live in Philadelphia. But the important bit actually goes back to a mini golf area in London in November of last year, where Richard and I met up and we were talking about this concept of language and gender together for the first time. And one of the topics that was brought up was how I had used social media to kind of explore these areas a little bit more. And he asked me to come speak, and ta-da, here I am in front of you. So before we start, I figure we all like words and language here. So I figure we can nerd out about language a little bit before I kick this off. And I want to go through some definitions of words that I'm going to be using a lot in the presentation. I don't want to assume that anyone has prior knowledge coming into this, so I want to make sure that we're all on the same page. And one thing that I do want to note is that these are definitions that I enjoy using. There are many others out there, and I invite you to explore those in your own time as well. So let's hop on over to the word bank. And the first word that I want to define is the word binary. So binary, very simply, is the sense of understanding that there's only two things that exist. There's 0 or 1, or right or wrong, or Pepsi or Coca-Cola. Like, there's only two options that you can choose from. On the opposite of that, there's non-binary, which very simply means that there's this sense that things exist beyond or outside or within this binary term. This word has also evolved recently to have a specific focus on gender and gender identities. It's got this sense of saying that anyone who expresses a gender identity that doesn't neatly or singularly fit on a gender binary. That's me. The binary terms becomes particularly relevant when we start thinking about pronouns. So hopefully we're all up to date in terms of what pronouns are, but to summarize them, they are a small set of words that we use in language to kind of replace or become shortcuts for nouns. There's examples such as this or who. In particular today, I'm going to be talking about personal pronouns like we or he. And in Latin languages, I think in actually a lot of languages, these pronouns tend to be very binary and very gendered. There's man, there's woman, there's he, there's she, and those are kind of really the only options that you have. In English, we do have a singular they, which is genderless, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. And I just want to make a side note here around it. You want to be really careful about using the word it as a personal pronoun. In most cases, it's considered offensive. So you'd want to check with someone before using an it pronoun for a person. Even in cases where languages, you've only got the it as a potential, gender neutral option. So I feel like I probably need to explore the word gender, because I've just said it about 17 billion times so far. And so we're going to do a little 101 class on gender. I promise we're not going to get too deep. You're not going to have to get out your Berkeley class books. So when it comes to gender, I'm inviting you to think around the three core concepts, three core pillars. And these pillars are pillars. They don't intersect at all. None of this is a Venmo diagram, or a Venn diagram. They're all very unique in terms of their setup. So the first one is sex. And sex is what we would typically say as our biological attributes, the sex that we're assigned at birth. Basically, it's like your junk. Like that's the sex side. And the kind of words that you use for sex are words like male, female, intersex, and a series of others that are available there too. The next one is gender identity. Now, gender identity is your inner sense of gender, your sense of self. And for those, you would use words that you're going to recognize: man, woman. There's also terms such as non-binary, gender fluid. There's a ton of terms. But identity, that's one that we're going to be focusing on today. And last but not least is this concept of gender expression, which is the myriad of ways in which we kind of manifest elements of our gender to others, and this may be through certain mannerisms, through clothes. You know, I think that if I do this, we all understand this to be a more feminine mannerism versus something like this is a bit more of a masculine expression of gender. So again, I think I want to hammer in the point that none of these relate to each other. You can have a completely separate identity and definition for all of these points. Having a certain sex doesn't necessarily dictate the kind of gender identity that you'll have, which then also doesn't necessarily dictate the kind of gender expression that you may have. Is that all making sense so far? Okay, I'm seeing a lot of nods, which is great. We're ready for Berkeley, y'all. So I'm going to take it a step further, which is that all of these are also on a spectrum. So you can be more or less of a certain thing, and that generally fluctuates throughout your life. So I may be feeling a little bit more masculine one day, a little bit more feminine the other day. None of these are fixed in space and time. And if you want to take it a step further still, gender theorist Judith Butler says that all of this is societal construct anyway, and none of it is real. But we're not going to get into gender and sociology theory just today. So the point I mentioned earlier, I think I've got a little clicker. Oh, fancy. Earlier on when I talked about identity, I said that that was where we're going to focus. And that's because when we talk about personal pronouns relate to gender identity. Your personal pronouns aren't for your sex or your expression. If you really think about it, it would be a little weird, you know? If you have a friend who typically wears skirts and all of a sudden she comes wearing trousers, you probably wouldn't switch pronoun for her unless she asked you to. Similarly, I mean, I'm not going to be looking into your trousers to figure out what pronoun to use because your junk is your junk, and I don't want to get involved in that. So pronouns really relate to your gender identity, and the great thing about that is that you get to set your pronouns, and you get to share that with other people. So I also then want to talk about some other gendered terms that you may be familiar with, which are cisgender and transgender. So cisgender has the Latin prefix meaning cis, which means this side or the same side. And it's basically the understanding that all of these things will probably align. So you may be male, you identify as a man, and you present in a pretty masculine way. In that way, you would be considered cisgendered. There's also another word, which is transgender. And the etymology there means across from. There's a sense of journey. There's a sense of kind of departure from one stage to another stage. And in that case, the way that all of these relate becomes more complex, but also wonderfully creative as well. You could have your identity that aligns with your sex. You could have it align with your expression, which is probably more common. You could have your expression align with your sex and not with your identity. Or you could be like, to heck with all of this, and have none of them interact with each other in whatever way whatsoever. So I know that all of this can be a little bit much to take in. I want to give you kind of like a neat little umbrella term through which to think about all of this, which is the concept of being gender expansive. So all gender expansive means is this understanding that gender is something that evolves and expands and isn't actually limited to just a few things. It kind of goes beyond the understanding of binary or non-binary. It's like, think of it as a universe. It's always moving, changing, expanding, growing, reducing, and language is a part of that expansion as well. So I want to end with one word that's particularly important to me. I want to include the word inclusion in our word bank for today. And I really want inclusion to be kind of like a mainstay theme throughout my talk in the fact that it's my view that no one suffers from having more inclusion. No one loses out when more people and more experiences are included in our communities and in our lived experiences, especially when it allows for more kind of creativity and connections with us as humans. So on that note, now that we've defined some words, we can hop back in to the actual presentation. So now that we've defined those words, you can be like, Abe, why does this all matter? Why are we here today? Well, There's a lot of reasons why you might want to explore gender-expansive language from the perspective of us as polyglots and perhaps linguists. The first could be that you simply want to have the opportunity to challenge language boundaries. Perhaps you want to push at things a little bit, find if there's some creative ways to do things a little differently. I think I see that trait in a lot of us, of having that but do we have to do it that way? The second is a kind of purposeful shift away from androcentric language, which is male-focused language. And you'll see this mostly led in feminist movements, kind of saying we need to move away from male by default in things like grammar and syntax, the world around us. And so it's very much that, how can we do things a little differently, and how can we signify that in language itself? And finally, and this is the one that kind of motivates me the most, is recognizing gender identities that exist beyond the binary that is typically what our language is based on. So there's a lot of other options. Hopefully, among these three, there's at least something that motivates you as a hook for us to keep going together. So, as I said, that third one is the one that matters to me the most. And one way that I find really helpful to talk about this is through the concept of pronouns, because I think it's a really good shortcut to understanding language and gender together. So let's take a look at that. So, one thing to note is that pronouns are always evolving. One easy example is the English thou, which became you, or in Spanish, the vos, which is no really longer used as a second personal pronoun, singular pronoun. There's only certain places like Argentina and Uruguay that still use it in that way. So pronouns are always evolving, and non-binary pronouns have been around for quite some time as well. Actually, Merriam-Webster says that they've been around since around the late 1300s, and that's, in English, the singular pronoun they. So there's a difference in terms of how they has evolved as well. They, back in the 1300s, was just used as a singular pronoun. They, nowadays, can also be used to signify non-binary identities. It can be used as that non-binary pronoun, and there's a difference between that. There's a slight kind of almost, grammar if you're talking about it. There's a really big difference between saying, I think someone left their umbrella here, where I don't need to know their gender isn't really relevant, compared to, I was at Abe's talk, I'm going to follow them on social media. There's a slight difference in terms of how you use the word they from that perspective. So then there's been research on this for quite some time as well. In a master's thesis from 1991 called Solving the Great Pronoun Problem, Kelly Ann Sippel provides an extensive list of all of the non-binary third-person singular pronouns that have been around for the last 150 years. And these are some of the ones that she highlights. Shout if you recognize any of these, by the way. Yeah. So most of these have gone, and I say most because there is one that really valiantly tried to break free from these gender terms, and that was the word thon. So thon is a contraction of that one, and it was so popular that it was used across texts very much so. It was created in 1852 by a guy called Charles Crozet Converse, which is, I think, a phenomenal name. And it was used a lot in writing, so much so that dictionaries, in fact, the Webster in 1934, actually listed it as a word that was in use. It wasn't very much used vocally, though, orally, and I think that that's part of the reason why it eventually fell out of style. So the one thing that gathers all of these together, bar the word they, is that they've all failed to catch on as gender-neutral pronouns. Now, though, there's something that's different. And can anyone name something that started emerging in the early noughties that might have had an impact on this? It's in the name of the talk.
Social media.
Yeah, social media. Remember this? MySpace, 2003? If you're not familiar with MySpace, you'll definitely recognize these two, Facebook and Twitter, and they became available to kind of the mass public in 2006. So what social media does is that it's a game changer in terms of how fast information and ideas can be communicated and shared. Suddenly things can kind of take up like wildfire and spread across the world with no regard for geographical location, or in some cases language, cost, it's free to use, and in most cases there's no censure either. So this no restraint means that suddenly you can have idea sharing in a way that is scaled up massively from what was available kind of pre-internet, pre-social media. And it becomes a space where you can create really strong online communities, especially through places like forums and blogs and platforms like Tumblr. And the great thing about these communities is that they become very strong and rooted. Actually, it's my understanding that the Polyglot Conference started as an online community, and it's evolved to the kind of wonderful space that we are at today. And the great thing about these communities is that you can share little nuggets of information that they will then take and share outside of that community with other communities as well. And so again, that information is sharing at a very high speed. And I talk about it as social media is a space where sparks can become infernos if you use the right hashtag. So with social media existing, it becomes a lot easier to have those ideas spreading. And we can actually, one of the things that I find fascinating is memes, how memes become a signifier of language in their own right. And I think that that could be its own conversation topic entirely. I'll pitch it to Richard after this. But this is, I think, a fascinating example. Does anyone understand this meme? I'm seeing some giggles, so I'm thinking yes. But you would have to understand 3 separate layers of memes to be able to understand this. And the reason we're looking at this is because I think it's a really good example of how social media can impact language and how language evolves. And if you're still wondering what this means at the end of the talk, come up to see me, I'll explain it to you. There's some meme anthology there, anthropology that needs to be uncovered there. But yeah, so the point is, social media changes how we communicate. It changes how fast words are spread. Another example is, does anyone remember the controversy when the word twerk was added to the Oxford English Dictionary? People were screaming bloody murder. They were like, it's the end of language, we're putting twerk in a dictionary. Well, some people, like Boppy the booty-shaking llama, really benefited from the word twerk being recognized. I mean, I could just watch that all day. We might, in fact, watch it all day. It just keeps going. So the reason why I'm talking about the word twerk, and you're currently looking at a twerking llama, is because it has a really big impact when dictionaries start becoming part of the conversation of language, especially on social media. When they do, when dictionaries start getting involved, I think it opens up language and language discovery as being descriptive rather than prescriptive. You move away from rigid forms and you're like, everyone's talking about twerking, we may as well get a definition for it. I think it kind of demonstrates the growth and evolution of language in a very public forum, which makes it, again, kind of a cyclical nature. It's public, it gets shared further, it becomes even bigger, it becomes a bigger word that's used by more people. So at this point, I have to confess something to you, and it's a little embarrassing. I have a huge crush on the Merriam-Webster Twitter account. That's right, I have a crush on a dictionary. And the reason why is because they use Twitter in a way that I find phenomenal. They go beyond simply tweeting out definitions. They actually have commentary on the words that they're adding there too. And I think that they take their role as kind of like historians of our language in a very up-to-date way. They're kind of exploring, well, hey, how can we share this meaning, these, like, memorialize these new words and be a part of that conversation at the same time? So I have some screenshots of some of my favorite tweets to share with you. Hopefully you all follow them as well. They may get a little peek in their following from this. So I love this one. And they posted this 3 years ago, and it may have been the one that made me follow them. But they basically say, people keep saying that they don't know what genderqueer means, but then they get upset when we add it to the dictionary. It's just the right amount of snark, I think, to be successful on Twitter. And Merriam-Webster often get caught up on these conversations over what's allowed to be in the dictionary or not. They often tweet a version of this particular tweet where they say, their role is to describe the world around them. They're there to be descriptive, not prescriptive. And one of the themes that they particularly get stuck up on is the word they. Aha, now you understand why I'm doing this. They talk about all the time they as a singular pronoun. And I think they do it because grammarians can get really frazzled by this, and they seem to take it as a kind of sport of sorts to annoy certain people. But they talk about here some topics that now we're familiar with of they existing as a non-binary pronoun and as a singular pronoun as well. Remember, we made kind of a distinction between those two uses early on. And I mean it when they're really serious about how they tweet about the word they. This is a selection of some of my favorites, but there's a ton of them out there. And actually, if you just look for hashtag non-binary or any of these themes on any social media site, you see that it's a big topic of conversation online. They even go so far as using catchy formats like limericks, like this one. My limerick voice laisse un peu à désirer, so I'm just going to let you read that and enjoy. Which I think is a great way of being nerdy and like grammar radical at the same time. So the last one I share that I promise that I'll share with you. So remember how we spoke around the word thon? Well, here's their picture of actually their edition from 1934 Webster Dictionary, and the definition is included on there. Now, the reason why this tweet is my favorite, it's a little bit cheeky, but they get to choose how they cropped that picture, right? They took that picture, they decided. And they decided to crop it just so that the word thong still featured in the screenshot, which I think is fabulous, and now means that I can say that I said the word thong in a presentation. So we're talking about this because I think that all of these conversations online, the more they happen, the more they get absorbed into more general understandings, such as dictionaries, it helps create momentum for these kind of words to be taken more seriously or more legitimately. It creates that kind of wind under the wings that allows you to take these concepts further. And it eventually means that some of these ideas turn into movements. And this happens both on social media and off of social media. So an example on social media is when Facebook changed, when Facebook changed the default pronoun for users to they. It was a big deal change online. But it also has an impact on the wider world. And I'm referring here to Iceland. Iceland recently had a discussion on the government and policy level to actually adopt a gender-neutral pronoun from another language, Han, and use it as a gender-neutral pronoun not only in culture, but also in kind of legal documents. So really formalizing that use of a gender-neutral word. Then this has been a trend that we see across Scandinavian languages as well, the adoption of more gender-neutral pronouns that are widespread. My personal favorite is, I mentioned this earlier, we've kind of come full circle now, is the lenguaje de todos, or the lenguaje inclusivo in Spanish. So the Spanish E, this was a game changer for me. It was the first time that I encountered a Romance language that had a really easy way for me to still be able to express myself and who I was. And lenguaje inclusivo, basically their kind of premise is that they keep the binary O and A endings of masculine and feminine, but they use one extra, which is the E. And the E is used to signify gender neutral or non-binary words. I think it's a brilliant approach because in practice it doesn't actually change much about how you speak Spanish. You don't really change the syntax and you're barely changing the pronunciation to the point where if I were to say estoy cansada to someone who didn't know about lenguaje inclusivo, they would still understand that I'm saying that I'm tired. They would understand what that means. You may have also heard of the use of the word, of the letter X in Spanish language, such as Latinx or Latinx. And I recently was kind of made aware that this can be considered a form of kind of neo-colonial language use. And the reason behind that is because the X actually stems from indigenous or mestiza people in the Mexican country area, or Mexican part of North America. And the letter X actually has a lot of different pronunciations and a lot of different uses. And for us to just use one way, one formulation of X actually fails to recognize the amount of kind of culture and history behind this one particular letter. I think it's used by Spaniards from Spain who are kind of like, bonus letter, we don't use this, let's adopt that. But I've been told that it's not ideal. It's also kind of hard to pronounce. It's kind of, you may have also seen the @ symbol used. From my perspective, these are hard to say. It's easy to see online, but you can't really pronounce an @ symbol with ease in terms of fluent language. And concepts being hard to pronounce or catch on, to me, they're a problem. So let's go back to French. In French, there's this movement called le langage épicène, which means language without gender or with both genders or none at the same time. And the way that they've kind of tried to figure out an answer here is that they use both binary endings to form a new ending. So when you think of the word acteur, actrice, they actually combine them together and make the word actrice. I don't know about you, but I find that really clunky to say, and I don't think it's very pretty, and it's still very much rooted in binary understandings of words. And the other thing that's important to recognize for this is that this is the langage épicène, it's very much led from a feminist movement perspective. It's very much that, if you recall the kind of motivations for doing this, it's that second tier of moving away from androcentric language, which is very much a thing in French. From my perspective, while I'm, of course, totally on board with that, from my perspective as a non-binary French person, it kind of fails to move past the binary in a way that makes me feel comfortable. So I've also loved exploring this year's theme, Indigenous languages, when it comes to gender. And the great thing about Indigenous languages is that they, of course, aren't restricted in some of the ways that more traditional Romance Occidental colonial languages are. They have completely different concepts or ways of using gender, which often has repercussions on how they talk about gender in language. And one example is, think of the Native American term two-spirit people. So this term was created to describe Native people with gender variants that were outside or beyond or completely nothing to do with Western understandings of gender. And words like this are actually present in many Indigenous languages. And I know that there's probably people in this room who are studying Indigenous languages right now. I think we're part of this movement of let's keep these languages alive. And I would encourage you to take pause when you are studying these languages, when you do encounter a gendered concept. I think that I would recommend that you kind of question yourself and say, am I bringing any kind of gendered baggage or assumptions with me in my understanding of this language? Of course, I can't not mention our host country in language, Japanese. I'm told this means non-binary language. I wouldn't know the difference. But I actually found a resource that had a list of many binary and non-binary terms in Japanese. And I would be happy to share these resources with anyone who's interested. I think it was, they had some history around how these words are formed as well, which was fascinating. While I've been here, I've actually had a whole range of conversations with people who speak Asiatic languages and how gender relates there. And it kind of ranges from, Japanese has 150 personal pronouns, all the way to Indonesian that has just one singular third-person pronoun, which by default makes it gender neutral. So we've got this whole scale of gender, which is completely separate again from the kind of more Romance Latin languages. And I don't know very much about this side of the world at all. And if you have particular knowledge about it, I'd love to hear about it. You've got the kind of my Twitter handle and a hashtag down there as well if you want to join the conversation around this. Now, while I've been here, I haven't been able to escape Esperanto. And I've actually been looking it up, and there's a whole movement to have more non-binary Esperanto terms as well. And I've really taken to this. I think it's part of how you can use the language creatively with different affixes and find non-binary, non-gendered solutions to talking Esperanto. Finally, I want to end kind of like on a note in terms of what we can do beyond language, if you are wanting to be more inclusive, but not necessarily language specific. So one thing you can do across any language is just avoid using pronouns altogether. It's a little cumbersome. You have to stick with the nouns, such as Abe is standing and Abe is talking about Abe's presentation. It gets a little long, but at least it allows you to not fall into a pitfall of potentially misgendering someone. If you are talking in a language that has pronouns that can be used in non-binary forms, I would encourage you to introduce yourself and share your own pronouns, even if they're aligned with your gender, if they're kind of like cisgender pronouns. Because when you do that, you open up a space where other people can share their pronouns, and they might surprise you. You creating that space means that people don't have to out themselves every single time if they do have non-binary pronouns or a pronoun that's different from what you might assume their pronoun to be. And if you are talking in a language that has no alternative pronouns whatsoever, I hope that you would be a vocal agent for change, kind of rattling at the rails and saying, no, we need to have better ways to be inclusive of all people who speak these languages. So I also want to leave you with things kind of beyond that personal mandate that I give you. And I want to talk about us as a community. And I think Ariel, just before me, did a really great job of talking about language activism and our roles as polyglots within language activism. I think it was a really good way of representing the community here. So I want to leave you with some kind of thinking and kind of action challenges. What can we do as polyglots and linguists to help carry the flame of inclusive language, make sure that it's representative? I do think that we have a responsibility. As polyglots, we learn languages, we talk about languages, we share languages in ways that can form them and evolve them and spread them across the globe. And I think that if we have kind of gender expansive at the forefront of our mind when we do that, I think that transforms the kind of conversations that we have. And one thing that really resonated with me so far this week was actually the introduction on day one, on Friday. The president of the university said this, which I think is a wonderful way of thinking about us as a community. He said that heterogeneous groups of people often question each other more than homogeneous groups do. And when you question each other, you question a social the status quo, and you find opportunities for improvement. I think we, in this room, in this polyglot conference, are probably one of the more heterogeneous communities right this moment on planet Earth, right? Like, we come from all over the world, we speak so many different languages, we're probably the definition of a heterogeneous community. And so I think we have a unique position where we can challenge the status quo a little bit and have these conversations that are going to be really interesting from that perspective of inclusion and creativity, and kind of gathering more people within ourselves. Throughout this weekend, I've had people come up to me and share their experiences of gender. And I want to share one with you that I found a little difficult. And that was, I keep hearing people who speak upwards of 6 languages, and they will still say that they feel like they have no way to talk about themselves in any of their languages or a few of their languages. And I think that's so sad, you know, to learn an entire language and to not feel like you have a sense of self in that language. So I think, you know, there's a discussion here that needs to be broadened within our community of what we can do as polyglots and as linguists to bust open the doors and have more conversations around this. I think the reaction to Richard's posts on Facebook was about the addition of the my pronouns are. I don't know if you saw that, but it sparked a really interesting conversation online in terms of the badges, with people being like, pronouns? All the way to, you know, these are my pronouns, or my language has 150 pronouns, or my language only has 1 pronoun. Like, it sparked a really interesting conversation, so I think there's the appetite. My hope is that this talk today has given you a few more kind of resources and talking and thinking points to progress from that point as well, and kind of equipped you with that information to go a little further. From my perspective, after spending the weekend with you all, I completely trust that you're a community that has the compassion and the commitment and the creativity to be able to explore these topics a little bit more. So on that, thank you for your time and attention. A big thank you to Richard for inviting me to the conference, and to The Social Element, who sponsored my ticket. Thank you to, of course, the university for hosting us, to Victoria, my partner, who introduced me to Lenguaje Inclusivo, and finally to all of the wonderful binary and non-binary people who help me progress in this journey and understanding every day. Thank you.
Hi, thanks, Abe. That was amazing. What direction do you imagine English going? Will, in 50 years' time, will we have 3 pronouns, or will we just call everybody they?
I would love to see they used as more of a default. Because I do think that there's still a place and an importance for gendered pronouns. I think that for all kinds of people where your sense of gender identity is strong and you're like, well, I really identify as a woman, I want people to refer to me with she, her pronouns. I think it's important that we respect that, of course, and that there be that exchange. I also think that where the harm comes from is when we tend to make more assumptions than invitations for discussion. And so what I would hope is that the kind of, you know, le réflexe, I can speak in multiple languages here. Like that le réflexe when it comes to interacting with people be, I don't know you, I've not met you before, we've not had a conversation around pronouns, so I'm gonna default to they.
Hi, Abe. Thank you so much for that. I think this is a really, really interesting discussion to be having at a conference like this, and thank you for bringing this issue to all of our attentions. Well, first thing was just a thought I was having, which is that it feels almost ironic or slightly, you know, unfortunate, I guess, that some of the languages which don't exhibit a lot of gender tend to be spoken in societies which aren't particularly progressive about gender. Like, I'm thinking about Hungarian, I'm thinking about Turkish, I'm thinking about Zulu, where, you know, I mean, in Zulu society, polygamy is okay for men but not for women, but there is no gendered pronouns whatsoever, and in English, Zulu speakers regularly say she instead of he, and they just get it all confused. So that was just a thought. But the question that I had was, have you got any examples of successful gender-neutral pronouns in languages like French or Spanish or anything which you think are particularly good? And not only good because we like them, but also good because they catch on, and do you think that other languages can learn from those examples?
Thanks for your question, Alex. And to your first comment and remark, I think that that's a really interesting one, and I want to touch on that briefly because I think that, you know, I kind of started off the presentation talking about how language can define our understanding of the world. And I think that when your language is very binary or restricted, it kind of limits how far you can go. In these languages where there may be kind of cultural backlash or changes that kind of prohibit certain levels of inclusion, at least language isn't doing that. And so I think there is an opportunity to kind of use language to push a little further and to kind of explore those topics a little further. Then if you didn't even have the language to talk about it, it kind of feels like there's nowhere to start. But in terms of your question, so there's the English they. In French, there's yel, which is a mix of il and elle, and it's not taken on at all. I mean, you'll see it in very like queer communities, but it's not really used in a general populace. Et vraiment, je ne le vois pas être utilisé beyond very specific communities either. In Spanish, yes, in Spanish, the E in the lenguaje inclusivo, part of why I was so excited about it, is that there is a much bigger kind of traction behind these terms. And actually, I do have a resource list. I have this book on they, which is fantastic. You might be interested in it. I would totally recommend it. It's a comic book. It takes 5 minutes to read. It's great. But I have an online resource that lists every single gender-neutral, non-binary, non-gendered pronoun in languages. It's kind of like an open source project, and I'd love for you to contribute to it as well. I'll pop it on my Twitter account in terms of a link to that.
I wanted to touch on the first question that we just heard and ask you if you could speak about neo-pronouns and what you think about the idea of English maybe having more than 3 pronouns in the future, which I think could happen.
So that's really interesting. So the question is, what do I think of neo-pronouns and going beyond not even a binary understanding of pronouns, but the understanding of pronouns as being limited at all? Thank you for your question, Han. I think it's fascinating, and to me, my training is as a historian. I did history in undergrad, and I can't help but think back to that slide with all of those dozens of pronouns where I feel like we've tried that before. Now, as I said in my talk, I think the resources that we have available to us now are very different. There's social media, there's more kind of language learning, but I think that for those kind of pronouns to be taken and to be adopted at any level, I think there would have to be something like what happened in Iceland, more of a kind of federal or government or really culturally push to use other pronouns. It's kind of the problem with French, is that if things don't come naturally, it's a little harder to adopt them. It's easier to co-opt a word like they or create an entirely new one, but then you also have the work of actually educating people and modifying language, which I don't think is a bad thing. Just because it's difficult doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. So I look forward to continuing the conversation with all of you online and offline as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much.